It's three things. Being CEO is basically three things. Number one is to be the holder of the vision. Number two is to be the yardstick of culture. And number three is to be that person that customers want to look into the eye before they buy your product. Everything else you build an office around.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 145 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to have Ashik Ahmed, the co-founder and CEO of Deputy, as my guest for this episode. Ashik launched Deputy in 2008, initially as the co-founder and CTO. He then transitioned over to the CEO role when Deputy raised their first round of capital, a Series A funding round in 2017. Since then, Deputy has been utilized by over 250,000 businesses across 100 countries and has raised $144 million in funding, including Australia's largest ever Series B funding round for $111 million. However, it hasn't all been plain sailing, with Deputy suffering significantly through COVID last year, having to stand down approximately 30% of their staff at that time. In this interview, we covered a wide range of topics, including how Ashik and Deputy managed the challenges that came with COVID, why founders need to retain their customer obsession and love customers who complain, Ashik's journey from being a software developer to the CEO role, Ashik's approach to fundraising and building relationships with investors, why more startups die from indigestion rather than starvation, and much more. Without further ado, here is my interview with Ashik Ahmed. Hi, Ashik. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Great to be here, Rohit, and really excited to be here.
Likewise, very, very excited to chat. I've got so many notes and so many things I want to talk about. But Ashik, for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
My name is Ashik Ahmed. I'm the CEO, CTO, and co-founder of Deputy. Deputy is a workforce management software company founded here in Australia, started 2008. Yeah, going for quite some time. We have offices in Sydney, San Fran, Atlanta, London, and as well as in Philippines. And Melbourne now. There's a couple of folks in Melbourne. And yeah, there's about 260,000 businesses around the world that is using Deputy. So yeah, it's been quite a wild ride.
Yeah, obviously very humble about everything that you've built with Deputy as well. I think one of the most exciting startups to come out of Australia, and as you mentioned, a huge sort of global user base as well. But Ashik, just wanted to go back to the start of the journey. You know, obviously Deputy's been around for a while. I think you launched in 2008.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was
November 3rd, 2008.
What was the early days of Deputy like?
Oh, early days of Deputy. You know, even though it's been will be about 13 years this year, I like to think Deputy has actually had 3-4 lives in there. Even prior to founding Deputy, I was actually working for my co-founder, Steve Shelley. I used to work in his business where Deputy kind of the precursor to Deputy, more of like an in-house solution was, I built an in-house solution for him. And then from there, you know, we started kind of the idea about, hey, if it can make such a big difference in one business, what if it can do it for every other business in the world? That's how kind of Deputy started. And I think the first 2 years was unlearning everything we have learned in the past business, which was a very complex business. It's aviation ground handling, and learning about the real world. And there's a lot of similarities, but a lot of things don't apply, and kind of rebuilding the product from the ground up. And we had hospitality and mindset. So yeah, a lot of unknown, if I can put it that way. There's no knowns, there's no unknowns. I think the first 2 years of Deputy was a lot of unknown.
Can you share what that process was like? Because I think, you know, this is often something that a lot of founders potentially have to go through, especially if they have been in a particular industry for a while and maybe they've been running a services business and being used to operating things in a particular way. What was that process like for you in terms of unlearning, you know, the previous habits or the previous ways that you sort of approach things, and how did you sort of identify those unknowns early on?
Look, it's good to have a conviction, but it's not good to be blind about that conviction. If I can summarize all my learning, like if I can go back to 2008 and give myself some advice, that would be it. It classically, I mean, if you're building an MVP, and maybe the inspiration over here has come because you have felt that pain and you wanted to solve it for yourself, Maybe the MVP validation has come because you've seen other people do it and you're building for it. However it has come, at that very early stage of the journey, the best thing anyone can do, any founder, and somewhere if somebody's starting their entrepreneurship journey now, my advice to them is put yourself in the shoes of the customer, okay? And whatever you gotta do it to make sure that you really solve the problem. I mean, building a great business is actually not that hard. I'm probably making it sound very simple. It is hard, but it's not that hard if you think of it this way. It's a very simple formula of A times B times C. A is solving a very unique problem, and that can be anything, okay? For us, it was all about workforce management or scheduling the right employee. B is people you have solved it for, make sure that they love you for it. And I mean the word love as love. Okay, in a sense, like what I like to define as love is that if you were to take it away, they'll beg and cry to get it back. That's what I mean by love. And C is finding more Bs who has As. A times B times C. So I think in the first years of Deputy, it was all about A. First 2 years was all A, to be honest, solving that problem. Later years was mainly B in terms of like making sure the people we have solved it for, they truly love us. And I'll tell you how seriously I take the love part. In Deputy, we actually measure NPS, where a customer can provide, NPS, a Net Promoter Score, like how likely you're to recommend Deputy to a colleague or another business. A score out of 10, 9 and 10 is promoters, 7, 8 is passive, anything 6 or below is kind of detractors. I used to read every feedback, okay? And if I ever got something that's not a 10 or 7, or I would personally follow up, okay? Every negative comment was a learning opportunity. And that has really, really helped the company and the product to be the best it can be, which actually led to our growth in a sense, because people change jobs, people will move on, and they have taken Deputy to all parts of the world. My advice is to focus on the A and the B.
Absolutely. In terms of kind of measuring that love, whether that's from NPS scores or otherwise, is there a particular stage that founders should really start taking that seriously or start implementing that into their business?
I don't think it ever finishes, to be honest. I still do that, much to dislike of many people in the company. No, I think you do that from your very first customer. You start doing that from your very first customer, and you continue doing that. And it's not just about you doing it, you as a founder, how you train other people in the company to do that, and how you publicly display that, okay? As much as the winnings or the failures. Because in this world, Rohit, I've realized only 1 out of 25 people will complain. So if somebody says something, whilst we always seek for the great feedback every time, if somebody is going to complain, they're doing a huge favor. My favorite customers are the ones who actually have complained and bothered to actually write a detailed negative feedback on why Deputy wasn't great for them, and really listening to them. I mean, we have a value in Deputy called listening to learn. Really listening to learn from it is what actually has set this company up for the success that we have had so far. We've got a long way to go. The company is not even at 0.05%. We are only at 0.05% of what we can be. That hunger of learning and doing is something that should always be constant. It's not about when you start. I don't think you ever finish.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that's something that came across in quite a few of the conversations and the research that I did for this interview as well, is the importance that you place on feedback and kind of measuring that love. One of the people that I spoke to was Howard Liebman, who was an early advisor in Deputy and also an investor now through EVP. I think one of the stories that he was mentioning to me was how every time before you would switch off the lights at the office, you would always listen to customer feedback, or go through the customer feedback and read sort of every line and action that the next day. I'm just really curious to sort of understand, from a perspective, obviously the early days, I imagine that was a lot easier to do. As the company continues to scale, as you're potentially a little bit further away from the customers, what sort of systems and processes do you develop to ensure that you still retain that closeness to your customers and to the feedback that you're getting about the product?
Well, it definitely gets harder with the volume of customers and separating the signal from the noise that comes in. Look, I mean, I'm approachable by the customer. Like every time somebody subscribes to Deputy, they actually get an email from me thanking them for placing their trust on Deputy. So in that way, they actually have my direct contact. So if they ever wanted to reach out to me, they definitely have that option in terms of reaching out to me directly. And if somebody is looking me up and writing to me, definitely something that I will look in. And then, whatever customer support communication tool you're using, there's so many different ways of filtering the data. Like, a chat that is going on for very long, a customer that is reporting an issue that I've never communicated. There's so many different ways you can slice and dice the data. Yeah, depending on the tool you use. I don't think if you're looking to listen and listen to learn, I don't think there should be a problem in doing that. There's ways you can achieve that. But for me, my hacks over here is that there are people who writes to me directly. We use intercom at Deputy, hey, some of the long chats that are going on for quite some time, customers that I kind of flag as flagship customers or lighthouse customers or canners in the coal mine, however you want to describe their so yeah, I definitely keep a lookout for that.
And is that something that you do periodically, or is that more of a daily habit to go through that feedback or to respond to emails?
At one point, this was a calendar block out time for me. Now things are a little bit more crazy, but if I don't do it daily, I'll definitely do it weekly, for sure.
I think one of the other sort of really interesting parts of your journey is obviously you started off as the CTO of the product, and then you sort of transitioned over to the CEO role. Really, again, curious to sort of understand what that process was like, because I understand that also aligned with your first round of capital, which is a Series A fundraise in 2016 as well. What was that like from a personal level of focusing on the CTO role and then having to transition over to a CEO role for a company that's growing so quickly?
From a personal level, great question. Right now, look, something that I've realized that as CTO, when I put my CTO hat on, I'm always thinking about how do we use technology to improve our customers' life. When I put my CEO hat on, I think about how do I enable the people of Deputy to be the best they can be and enrich their life so they can go and service the customer through product or technology or service or sales or marketing, however you think about it. Now, I mean, if somebody is going from a technical role to CEO, if someone's making that transition, I mean, the one advice that I got that has been very helpful, like when you are CTO, you're kind of always thinking about programming computer to get a job done. When you are CEO, you're thinking of inspiring. I'm not going to use the word programming, but inspiring people's mind about how they can be the best they can be in there. That's the fundamental difference. From a personal point of view, I was never thinking ever I ever had this thought that I'm going to be CEO of Deputy when I founded Deputy. I did not even know what the job entails or anything like that. We had other people running the business where we even had a CEO that even as a co-founder, I'll be working for him. And that resulted in quite a lot of indigestion in the business. That's the first 4 years of Deputy. Once we built product, I think we didn't actually have the right kind of captain driving the company in the right direction. In 2013, I kind of realized, end of 2012, I realized that no one's gonna come in and build my company for me. No one's gonna make this happen. I have to take ownership. So I still didn't take the CEO. I didn't have a CEO role. I still was the CTO, but I was working so much that I would do everything in terms of running business development, sales, partnership, hiring, HR, you name it, during the day, and at night I would code literally, or weekends. It was a lot of hard work. My wife, she has amazing patience, newly married at the very same time, having kids, and yeah, it was very challenging in the early days, but all the hard work kind of paid off. And then I think when we were doing our Series A back in 2016, I mean, our mindset was, even in the investor deck, there's no one as CEO, okay? There's no one as CEO in the org structure. and that, hey, so what's your thought around, what is the company's thought about a CEO role? And my answer was that, hey, maybe the investors, they have entrepreneurs in residence, or they'll bring somebody on. And I remember in one of these particular investor pitches back in 2016, Steve Laughlin at Axel Partners, asked the same question. What is the thought? I'm like, oh, you guys put in somebody in Invoice to Go. They were maybe you have talent that you can put in deputy. And their question was, have I ever thought about being CEO? And I looked at Howard was in the room, so was Steve, and I'm like, looked at them like, what? Like, no, I don't even know what to begin for it. And they said, look, it's three things. Being CEO is basically three things. Number one is to be the holder of the vision. Number two is to be the yardstick of culture. And number three is to be that person that customers want to look into the eye before they buy your product. Everything else you build an office around the CEO to perform. It's not about being the best person in legal, corp dev, or product, or sales, or marketing, or none of those things. And they go like, it shows you are already doing this. We see hundreds of pitches. I think there was, there's that line in Lord of the Rings where Cate Blanchett goes to Elijah, this task was appointed to you. If you don't do it, no one will. I felt like that moment happening in a sense. I think it took me about over a year to figure out exactly what the role entails. But now, I'm immensely grateful for the support that I've had from my board and Howard, for that matter. I think learning so much and still learning so much. But it's a privilege. It's a privilege for someone like me to have this opportunity.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you never imagined yourself as a CEO of Deputy. In my conversations with Howard, as well as Lissy, who is your head of design at Deputy, employee number 25 as well, I think Howard mentioned that he couldn't imagine you in a role that wasn't the CEO role. And Lissy kind of mentioned that you were sort of almost destined to be, you were born to be the CEO of Deputy. Well, one of the other things that kind of came from my conversations with them was your superpower to really learn and absorb information. And, especially learning the CEO role can be very intensive, especially for a company that's growing as quickly as Deputy is. The role is kind of constantly evolving and changing every 6 months or so. How do you sort of approach learning, or what was the sort of process that you went through, or people that you learned from, to understand how you could perform the role better as the CEO of Deputy?
To be honest, Rohit, I'm still learning. Every year I look back in December to the beginning of the year, and I'm like, I look at myself and I was so stupid at the beginning of the year. Okay, I've had to learn so much. Like, I think 2020 was probably the biggest learning of all, for all things. Prior to that, I think I learned a lot by reading and seeing things, but 2020 was a year of where, yes, you saw and read, but oh my God, you had to learn by doing. There's no playbook for 2020. So I think I'm still learning, to be honest, right? So I wouldn't say that, hey, what are the process? My advice to anyone who is thinking of being CEO, founder, co-founder, or even taking on a CEO role somewhere is, like, you gotta be super, super humble. Okay, you have to be super humble to admit that you're a moron, you don't know have answers to all the questions, and listen and learn from it, and then apply that learning. Life is not about how smart you are. Life is about how fast you can learn and apply that learning in life. It's as simple as that. Okay, how fast do you learn and apply that learning in life? And the way I look at myself is that if the company is doubling every year, I have to grow my leadership. Okay, who I am as a person, at least double of that what I was the year before. If I don't have that, then I will be the biggest bottleneck in the growth of and the opportunity of the company. There's a saying by Peter Drucker, a management expert, is that the bottleneck of a bottle is usually at the top. So I've got a long way to go in my learning and how I apply that learning.
Absolutely agree with you in terms of in terms of like the importance of learning. Just curious to know if there are any particular resources that you lent on in kind of the early days, or, you know, you mentioned 2020 as well, anything that sort of helped you understand how to handle particular situations or helped you double your own growth as an individual over the last few years?
I do read a lot. I do read a lot. I try to actually read probably one book a week where possible. And I've been doing that for a couple of years. And yeah, there's no shortage of great recommendations. And you know, you can pick any topic. Okay, is it organizational development? Is it leadership? Is it go to market? Is it product management? Is it strategy? There's like so many great books that people can read. And depending on the biggest problem the company is going to go and solve in a particular year, that's probably like, what's the best book that somebody has read in that topic. I would ask people, I would ask my network, other CEOs, and what advice and wisdom they have had, what is their advice if they had to go and relive their life. I think people, like, because of social media and others, you know, people, a lot of knowledge is available. So I don't think there should be anything that should limit somebody from learning more. But the danger thing over here, Rohit, is that what I like to call is doing a monkey see, monkey do. Okay, that's what that person have done, and I'm gonna go do that. That's probably the most wrong way of doing things. Every organization is different. You, as an individual, I'm as an individual, I am different than others. I have a lot of shortcomings. Okay, so English is my second language, for example. So there's a lot I have to cover differently than somebody else. So you don't let others make the decision for you. You have to make your own decision, but be humble, keep learning. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, 2020 being, probably the year of the biggest growth for you as a leader. On the podcast, I've had previous guests like Simon Griffiths from Who Gives a Crap, who obviously benefited immensely from a business context of all of the effects that came with 2020 and COVID. Obviously 2020 was a difficult year for Deputy as well. And I think it was roughly a year ago, or almost exactly a year ago, where you were in the US and onboarding your new president and COO of the organization when things were just about to hit. Again, can you kind of talk through what last year was like, and especially kind of, I guess, starting from the start of first seeing the impacts of COVID and what that was like for you?
You're opening up some wounds over here.
We get in deep.
So, no, look, it was hard to kind of know what media is saying. Okay, everybody is saying different, depending on who you follow in Twitter, who you listen to. It's lots of different advice that was going on. Okay, there are some people who are just completely denying it, and some people are all panicking about it. I mean, being an entrepreneur, I would say that I'm an optimist. So I like to think it's not going to be a problem. And I was still traveling. I mean, I think even late February, I just did an Atlanta trip and I got back. And then just mid-March, just within a week after coming back to Australia, I was going to go out again to US to onboard Dave Zinman, who is our president. I've just hired him. He's starting 9th of March. And I came to San Fran, and yeah, the city was rather quiet. It's still not that quiet. And I was on a Wednesday afternoon when San Francisco down to San Jose, and I was going down to meet someone for dinner. And I remember getting on the train, and the whole carriage was empty. Like, it's only Dave and me. And remember being on the train before, and it used to be packed. And none of the lockdowns, nothing has happened yet, okay? It's nothing. And then it hit me, oh my God, all these people would have come to work today. All these people would have gone out for coffees, drinks, lunch, dinner, you name it. The impact on the economy that it's going to have, just to all the other industries, is going to be massive. That's when I went, in that train, I went like, oh shit, it's about to get bad. And then I'm like, okay, I got to get back home and ensure things are in order here in Australia. And whilst I was in the train, I remember, there's quite a lot of other conversation. Next day, Donald Trump shuts down the, I think European flights. A lot of other things, NBA was canceled, all sorts of different things. I think I just slipped in just before there was, kind of quarantine, at least in-home quarantine that you had to do. As we then came in, and then we started seeing data in our customer that how it was impacting them. one of the leading indicator over here is like, hey, how many people are getting rostered versus how many people are working? How soon customers were publishing their rosters? Like, in Deputy, you can publish your schedule, say 2-3 weeks, as long as you want. It used to be on average about 12 to 14 days. That number came down to 7 and below. So meaning like, managers who published rosters, they weren't necessarily confident as much. So they were not like broadcasting too ahead. And we started seeing some of those, early signs that, okay, it's going to get bad. And then, yes, as the lockdown things happened, it did get bad. We started seeing a lot of kind of customer downgrade requests or other things, or customer help. Our team worked really, really hard to, do some product innovation to help our customers. One of the values we have in Deputy is clock in for the customer. But anyway, we did a mission vision values project later in the year, but I'm using those values even talking about what has existed in Deputy even prior to those values coming on, especially about like helping customers not having to churn but pause their billing. Deputy is priced based on the number of employees you have on the platform. So if the business is not going to have any income, they're not working. So we, as opposed to just churning and losing that customer relationship, you allow people to pause their billing. At the very same time, those who are operating, how can we help them operate? And we did quite a lot of product innovations around newsfeed communication in terms of how people can communicate. We rolled out touchless clock-in, where people are able to clock in by facially recognizing their face. The iPad recognizes their face. There's also pre-shift questionnaires about, hey, what's your temperature and things, all these things about wellness for shift workers, for those who are still operating. Yeah, the team did a lot of great work to help our customers in there. And yes, as a team, we had to figure out how to work remotely. Deputy is a software where we help businesses, especially with shift workers, coming into a workplace. I love being at a workplace. I'm even in my office right now, and it's not locked down in Sydney for your international audience. And it's a great place to come in for work. And all of a sudden, we had to discover how to be, remote work, how to be at home. Yeah, I think the team did a great job in terms of switching gears and being remote first, and still delivering a lot of value for our customers. I'm really proud of the team in terms of how they navigated. But yeah, there was a massive impact on the company and its cash flow. We had to make some drastic restructuring in the organization, which was very, very painful. For years before, we have been a recruitment role to bring all these people into the company, and then all of a sudden we had to make all these changes. That was very, very tough. At one point, with the financial modeling and other things we were looking at, is like, if it gets really bad, we might be looking at something where the company doesn't even survive, for example. So we had to make some really drastic changes in the organization, restructuring, and at the very same time had to shift our focus. Historically speaking, we have been very hospitality, retail kind of focused business, but beginning of COVID, we switched to being healthcare focused, and that had a very amazing return. Like, I remember saying every single day there was at least 3 new COVID call centers that got set up in Deputy. Because of the product-led growth nature of the business, people were able to come in and just sign up to the product, put on their credit card, and start using it. Okay, or trial the product even without their credit card. And that resulted in net what ended up happening coming out of 2020. We actually, right now, both the growth rate and the revenue of the business is higher than what it was pre-COVID. I did not know that's how it's going to pan out, but we have been very, very fortunate. The team really delivered to make it happen. So yeah, all in all, 2020 was the hardest year, but it was also our finest hour.
Absolutely. And I think it's, oftentimes a lot of the conversation is based around, a lot of the conversations that you hear is, things are always great and we're always growing and we're always sort of moving up and to the right. As you mentioned, last year was very challenging for a lot of different businesses. And I hope that you and Howard don't mind me mentioning something that he mentioned in a conversation between the two of you about, how you were essentially selling the vision for what Deputy was and could be, just a couple of months prior, and then, having to have difficult conversations with people that you unfortunately have to let go for the long-term survival of the business. Again, these are not sort of conversations that you hear a lot, but how do you, as the leader of the organization who has to make these difficult decisions, how do you approach that? And then how do you help your, senior team leaders and team manage those type of conversations as well with kind of the broader team and the decisions that are made?
I don't think there's any specific playbook for it, to be honest, Rohit, but two of the fundamental principles, I mean, if there's any parting wisdom that I may have, or if I can go back to to March 2020 and give myself some advice, although I think I have followed this, it's two things. Is put yourself on the shoes of the person, you're making this decision for, and put yourself in their shoe in terms of how you're communicating this decision. That's one thing. And the other one is love people on the way out just as much as you have loved them on the way in. Regardless of COVID or restructure or not, things don't often work out. And when it comes to having that honest conversation with someone, put yourself in the other person's shoe. Love them on the way out just as much as you love them on the way in. It was extremely difficult. It was extremely difficult for all the conversations many of us had to have. Nobody saw COVID coming. In the other side, Rohit, many people have found great opportunities. Some people have actually even come back to Deputy. Not all, but some have come back. But yeah, I mean, when in terms of how the decision was made, it was nothing personal as such. It was more about, hey, what we need in the company to survive, okay, and how do we ensure that we have bare minimum resources over here to at least keep the lights on, and then actually go through and restructuring and getting things right. Actually, things have worked out luckily very well. I mean, the way the business bounced back, I did not expect that. The board did not expect that. Okay, it has bounced. I mean, it's actually two things that has resulted in company being successful out of COVID on the latter part of it, simply because number one was the focus around healthcare, and the number two thing was Australia has bounced back. And given that so much of our customer base is here in Australia, these two things have really, really helped. Globally, the healthcare, and here in Australia, the business is getting back online. We did not predict that. Nobody knew how long the lockdown is going to be. Nobody predicted the second medical lockdown, or if there's a third one or not. But when it comes to the conversation, to answer your original question, put yourself in others' shoe. Matter of fact, it doesn't matter whether you're a CEO or a product manager or a salesperson or a customer success person or a marketer. Doesn't matter what it is. The number one thing everyone should learn to do in life is, can you put yourself in somebody else's shoe and think from their point of view. And that's my advice for the early part of my journey as well, putting myself in the customer's shoe and solving it for them.
Absolutely. Great advice, not just in business, but I think in life in general. I guess that kind of touches on another story that Lissy shared with me as well, was around the time when you were CTO and you had asked her to do a bit of work to create a design for something, and you replied back saying, I hate it.
Okay,
but what Lissy mentioned, and she said, kind of remains to this day, is, this need to, or this want as a team to impress you, because no one really understands the customer as well as you do. And, just from some of the conversations that I've had in the lead up to this interview as well, the culture that you've built is absolutely incredible at Deputy, from the sounds of it. Just really curious to know from your perspective, how do you sort of approach building that culture and building that sort of customer focus as it's a lot easier to do when you're a small team of 5 to 10 people. It's much harder to do that when you're working globally and have over 300 customers. How do you approach that as a CEO?
Well, first of all, I should probably go back to Lizzie and apologize. Actually, not probably, I will. Okay, I don't know where it was for the hate one. Language to be used over there should be, let's have a conversation about how we can probably improve that, or can I understand more? Not a judgmental comment like hated. Okay. Now, it's the question regarding the customer centricity. Well, first of all, it's in our value, and the one way we'd like to, okay, let me say this. We talk about culture, you're talking about customer centricity. Okay, culture means different things to different people. Okay, but at the end of the day, culture is how people behave. How people behave in the organization. That's where you get to see culture. And what are the drivers of culture? Culture is driven by value. What are your values? And how well do you practice and endorse those values? Deputy has 5 values. and I've mentioned this now throughout this interview. The number one value of Deputy is listen to learn. Number two value of Deputy is clock in for the customer. Number three value of Deputy is stronger together. And this is the community feeling in Deputy. It's like, it's not just individual things. All of us together is what makes this company stronger. And I have a fundamental belief that people don't come to work for work. People come to work to be part of a community. And that's where this stronger together value comes in. Number four is lead with integrity. And number five is own your shift, which is the ownership. A little bit of deputization going on in all the values. Now, what we like to do is when we make decision, we try to communicate those decisions based on the values. Hey, we're clocking in for the customer here. Even in our all hands or all our recognition actually gets done on the values. I try to preach it at every opportunity I can. And that value of clocking for the customer is what actually drives that customer centricity feeling in Deputy. We're early in our journey. I mean, as I said, it's one thing that I do it. It's another thing that how do I coach others to do it and coach them to coach even the next generation of Deputy on how to do it. I'm still learning that skill, right? So I wouldn't say that we have absolutely mastered it. We're still figuring things out, but we're doing well. I'm really impressed with how even Lizzie, for example, herself really has championed. Like Lizzie, to learn about the customers, she actually has traveled the whole world. I'm not kidding. Like, going to San Fran, to New York, to Atlanta, to London. She has traveled the world to learn about our customers as well. Obviously, I can't do that with COVID. We're doing quite a lot of Zoom interviews, but that feeling, that empathy, that understanding their pain, that will continue in this company for a long, long time.
Any advice to founders who are potentially going through that for the first time, where they have to instill those values or teaching others about that in what that sort of initial first step might look like?
Is a question regarding value or a question regarding customer centricity? Which one?
Regarding values.
Regarding values.
Particularly when it comes to hiring. So if you're looking to sort of expand out your team and you're sort of enabling others to be part of that hiring process, where maybe at the start you have a little bit more control and you're sort of enabling other people to make that decision. How do you sort of transmit the core values that you have onto others? So
in Deputy, the values of Deputy is not something that I wrote down, okay? It's not that. We actually had in 2020, we actually took the opportunity to really look at the business, okay? And I really looked at that, hey, if I was to refound the business again, how would I do? What are the things I would get right? And what are the things that we have always talked about but never done? Like really being very clear about mission, vision, values. In past, many of those exercises used to be done like, just the founders or co-founders or an exec team. In 2020, we actually did something rather unique. We set up kind of like a employee community, okay? There was people from all around the world that joined this committee, and we came up with the values. I actually did not necessarily, I don't think there's only one or two words I got to inject. Most of the words over here that I've uttered so far is actually come from the team. So I would say that if you're starting a journey, at first you can have some values that you can put down on the paper, the things that are more important to you. But as the company matures and grows up, then you get other people involved. Your company is going to change as you are maturing, as the company is maturing. So you should get others involved and relook at it, redo it. And we did a great exercise last year. It took months of work. Myself, Matt Beach, who is our PR and communications director, us two was kind of driving this. However, we had input from the whole business in terms of how we came up with our mission statement, our vision statement, and our values. And for better part of 2020, that was actually what I did. And my advice to anybody who's founding business at the moment is that you actually have to do this work. You have to set it. If you don't set it, it's going to set itself, and it might not be something that you like. So please set it in terms of how you want the culture, the values, and the mission, vision of the company is. And then as you go through in your journey, you revise it, you evolve it, you refresh it. And that's what we have done. And you keep endorsing it, okay? You keep endorsing it, hiring, decision-making, performance reviews, all hands. These are all ways of kind of inspiring people with the values.
Absolutely. Part of the journey for companies and in sort of inspiring people is trying to inspire not just your team and your customers, but if you are a high growth tech startup, most likely investors as well. I think you sent through an incredible article that Howard wrote on the journey that you had to raising your Series A with OpenView, which I'll link through in the show notes as well. But also in reference to this interview, I spoke to Paul Bassett from SquarePeg Capital, who's also one of the investors, who I believe was one of the investors in your Series B round as well. And one of the things that he mentioned to me was almost in the very first meeting with you, he walked away knowing that he would want to invest and feeling very convicted about you and the business. But from what I understand, it was a 2-year journey from when they first met to getting to know you and the business to eventually getting in on your Series B. Again, what does that process look like for you from a fundraising perspective? Because, oftentimes a lot of investors talk about the need or the want to build relationships with founders to better understand them, but there often isn't a lot of conversation in terms of what that relationship building looks like. Can you share, what did that relationship building with SquarePeg specifically, or kind of for your Series B round look like for you?
Once again, there isn't specifically a playbook, okay, but there's a couple of principles, okay. Principle I would like to really pass on for anybody, who's thinking about a fundraise is, first of all, be humble and don't try to be cocky, okay? I think some people try to really be very bullish in front of investor. Some investors may like it, some investors don't. You kind of have to be authentic yourself, and you're doing it because it has to be done. There isn't anything else that will stop you from not achieving it, and you're willing to do whatever is necessary to make sure that the mission you have embarked on will be fulfilled, and you have deep level of empathy for the problem you're solving, and you'll just be at it. And I don't know what Paul saw in me, to be honest. I can't comment on that, but there are so many great founders in terms of how they talk about their vision and the passion they have for their customer. I think it's very evident, and a lot of people have done this very, very well, be it Toby at Shopify or Mel at Canva, or even Elon Musk for Tesla, okay, you name it. You gotta have passion, and if the passion is authentic, it will come through. It will come through. In relationship building with investors, look, you have to understand that the investors see a lot of other founders as well, okay? They will be seeing a lot of startups, and they have kind of machine learned in their mind about what's good or what's not good in there. Don't try to game it. Do not try to game it. That's my advice. So I don't remember what I said or something like that with Paul in our first meeting. I'm very bullish about what the company needs to do and what why we exist, what we are doing, how we're going to get there. So I just speak the truth and speak from your heart. The right investors will like you, and the wrong investors may not like you. And this is very much a relationship as well, okay? So if they like you, then something great will happen. I'm very fortunate that someone like Paul has decided to invest in Deputy as well as me, for that matter. One piece of advice that he had given that I always pass on and I always talk about is that hunger triumphs experience, okay? It's my hunger. It's our hunger on what we can achieve, and that humbleness to learn to gain that experience is what's gonna determine how successful we are as a company. Right, for any startup founder, okay, there's only 3 limiting factors in life: your dream of how successful you want to be, your will to execute on that dream, and laws of physics. Great thing about software is that laws of physics don't apply. So you can be your own limiter. So long as you know how to unlock and unleash yourself and your team, there's nothing that should stop someone.
That is fantastic advice, Ashik. Final question from me before we wrap up this interview. I know that you've got a hard stop as well. What you just mentioned in terms of having that hunger, is so critical to founders. It's also a trait that everyone that I spoke to also mentioned about you in terms of your relentlessness, how driven you are, how ambitious you are, and your kind of clear vision that you have for the future. For a lot of founders though, who have this really, really broad vision and are super driven, sometimes the pace of like the vision, the scope of the ambition outpaces your ability to execute on that. And, it's very easy to, again, sort of look at Deputy's journey and sort of think that a lot of this happened overnight. But as you mentioned, this is a 13-year journey in getting to the stage that you're at now. As you mentioned, only 0.5% of where, Deputy could be in the future as well. How do you balance, I guess, the vision that you have and the pace of operation that you want to execute at versus understanding limiting factors of being able to execute against that as well?
I can probably do a whole podcast, another hour talk just on that topic.
Part two.
No, look, knowing what I know now, if I was to restart Deputy, I think I will get where I am right now in 1/3 of the time, to be honest. And the fundamental advice in there is try not to chase everything. More companies die from indigestion as opposed to starvation. Focus on the right goals, okay? And whether the goal is right or not, it's hard to know when you're making that goal. There's one great advice in one of your podcasts I learned that DHA said is that, what are the things do you know that's going to be true in 10 years time? Just focus on those ones, okay? That Jeff Bezos get to DHH and Jason Fried. That also is a great advice of looking at, what are the right goals, okay? But pick the goal and execute fast on it. Pick one goal, execute fast on it. If I can go back and tell myself a few things, that would be, don't chase everything. I mean, back then I was probably a bit too naive and every opportunity sounded like a great idea to go and do. And I think I suffered from reality distortion field about just not having any respect for the time limits of life. But everyone has 24 hours in a day, and life is nothing but a set of days. So better focus on what you are working on and getting that done fast, as opposed to doing too many things at the very same time. Some people can get lucky luck is a big factor, don't get me wrong, but some people get lucky by doing a lot of things at the same time and everything works out. But luck does not always show up on your side, okay? And life evens out. So I would rather focus on the things you can control. So pick the goals and execute really, really well on it. If you think something's going to take a year to get done, can you get it done in a month? If you think it's going to get done take a month to get done, can you get it done in a week? Can the week be done in a day? That kind of clarity on focus and execution is what's going to separate the good from the great. It's all about discipline. The difference between good and great is nothing but discipline. You look at any sports athlete, any great CEO versus a good CEO, the one thing that differing is the great always has a degree of discipline that the good don't.
Fantastic. Ashik, I could talk to you all day, but we better wrap it there, unless you're going to come back for a part two to do another podcast on some of the
maybe in a year's time, Rohit. Maybe in a year's time.
We'll definitely make a fun time to make that happen. But Ashik, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today. For anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, at Twitter, at Deputy Ashik, or LinkedIn. And by the way, if anybody's looking for a new opportunity, deputy.com/careers. I think we're, at the recording of this podcast, we're hiring at least 40 people, and we'll be hiring more and more. So please apply. We are looking for roles in pretty much people in every role.
Fantastic. I will make sure all of those links are in the show notes. On that note, Ashik, thank you once again for coming on the show and for sharing your experience and insights. It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and look forward to chatting again in future, hopefully.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to episode 145 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'm taking a week off next week for Easter, and I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of the Startup Playbook podcast. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.